Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Marr, and I am back with step 2 of how to make a ceramic mask. This is the armature that we did in step 1, and I want to remind everybody that this is not part of the mask. It's just saving space to make things three-dimensional. Remember we talked about the fact that we don't want our clay to be any thinner than our pinky or thicker than our thumb. In most cases. There are definitely times when it would be, but for this purpose, if we want something that's going to be big and stick out, it can't be solid. It's got to be hollow. So what we do is we make an armature to save the space, and then we put a slab over it. And in this case, we talked about making a beak. So we don't want it to curve around, so we're going to build the thin part of the beak on top of the mask. It'll make more sense to you in a minute. The first thing we're going to do is get clay, make sure it's pretty well wedged. And this is a big piece. You want a bigger piece. Like, you're not just going to take and make a slab, which is what we're going to do as a slab. It's like rolling out pie dough. You're not going to make it the size of the mask form around here. Because remember, we have all this space that we need to drape the mask over. So it needs to be bigger than you would imagine. And it's always easier to make it big in the first place than to go back and try and patch it. So we want our slab to be consistent, and one of the ways that we do that is we use sticks. Now if you look at these sticks, these two are the same thickness. Actually, these two are the same thickness. This one is thicker. Okay? So we want two that are the same thickness. Now I wouldn't get too much thinner than this because we're going to push that clay around a fair bit, but you don't want it too thick either. So the reason we would do that is we're going to put it on either side, and when the rolling pin gets to the point where it's hitting the sticks, then you know it's consistently that thick. Okay? This might take a minute, and you might want to flip it around depending on what surface you're working on. You don't want it to stick. Remember, it's got to go down the sides as well as, from top to bottom. It's got to drape from left to right too. This is just a folding table, so I don't want to push it into the camera. Alright, so we've got it in the length, I think. But we also want to get our width kind of wider. Okay, now at this point everybody should have figured out their character, the personality, role in the community, physical characteristics that reflect that. And it can be as crazy and made up as you want it to be. It can have whatever purpose. We talked about different masks and the different purposes: ceremonial, theater, celebratory. There's lots of different possibilities from different cultures around the world. And at this point you will have figured out what culture you're going to be inspired by too. So now we have our slab. It's nice and even. I was spending more time talking. Basically, it should be the same level as the stick all the way around. And the saran wrap is crucial. You do not want your slab to touch any of the clay that's underneath. And you're going to start in the center. Probably wet your hand. Make sure you have equal amounts. You want it to go all the way to the ground or the table on both sides. I'll just have to take a look at where my thing was. Okay. So this is the center part. That's where the snout is going to be, or the beak is going to be. This will fold right down. This is where we didn't want the beak to hook over. You couldn't take this slab and hook it up and over and around because you wouldn't be able to get it out. Okay, but you want to hug the form, starting in the center and working out. And for our assignment, there was the expectation that there was going to be things that stuck out from the mold. Okay. Now, you might have excess and you might leave it there because you might decide to do something else with it. Maybe this bird has a mohawk, who knows? Or he's wearing a hat, or he's got ears, or who knows? Okay. But we have our big bulging eyes under there, and we can actually push around the clay that's in the armature under the saran wrap. Okay, I didn't make that eye bulge quite as much. And you can also push the brows if we want to make them mad. We have a chart that shows a lot of different facial expressions, not necessarily bird facial expressions, but there's plenty of cartoon ones. So you can use that, but I think the eyebrows are a good way to show if something is happy or sad or mad or whatever it may be. So that is the basis of it. And when you cut it, and I'm not saying you should cut it yet, but when you do get ready to cut it, make sure you go straight down. You don't want to have a cookie cutter edge, so you want to make sure that you go all the way down. You don't want to see the white of the armature underneath at any point. I'm going to cut this because I'm going to try to use the excess. And had I been smart, I would have pushed the excess down to one end, so I don't have to roll out another slab for the beak. But I am going to try and do that. I'm going to cut it off here. Maybe leave a little bit of excess. Slide it over a little bit, and that's still pretty thick, and we can still stretch it out and smooth it, make it have a nice edge. You also remember you want to put holes in it. This is a pretty heavy armature because of that big piece of clay on there. So now this, we don't need it as thick. However, we do, we want it thick enough to attach. So I'm probably going to make one end of it. I'm going to use this as one part of the beak, and I'm thinning it down at the tip, okay, and leaving it round. Things that have a curve to them are much stronger than things that are flat. So imagine if you were doing a sun and it had all sorts of rays coming out. You might cut them as flat slabs, but you're going to want to curl them up. First of all, when this is bone dry, it's going to be very fragile. So if you put it down and it hits with the ray first, you're probably going to crack the ray off of it. But it also adds a little more character to have them curving. So they can curve where they're attached here, and that'll add strength. But they can also curve up and away, and that will add strength, and keep it from hitting first on the table. So let's say we're going to, I don't know how much I need here, but let's just do more rather than less at first. Okay, now anything that we add to the clay, and we're going to use both an additive and a reductive process with this. I'm trying to do this without moving my armature. Anything that we're going to add to the clay, we want to make sure we slip and score it. So I left the part of the beak that's going to attach to this part of the mask pretty thick. Okay, and the reason I did that is I know that I want a surface to score there, but I also know that I am going to push away at it and it's going to get thinner. Alright, so in this we can definitely thin to almost nothing, but we want enough structure to work with it. So I'm just kind of testing where I want that now. So maybe that's going to come out like that and curve over. This can curve now, but it's because it's on top of the mask. This is pretty wet. I almost don't have to do this. And keep in mind, it's maybe as thick as my pinky here. So you can't dig too deep. Okay, we're going to put some more slip in there. And all along there. It'll get messy before it gets smooth. That's alright. I'm going to make the top beak kind of big, and then the lower beak not as much so. And I'm smoothing, I don't know if you can see, but I'm smoothing it here. So that thickness that was down at the base is becoming what's holding it together. And I want to be able to get underneath and do that on both the outside of the beak and the inside. Now we need to remember, we don't want to make an air bubble either. So if we were to close the bottom of this beak, that would be an air bubble, and we'd have to make sure that we go through the clay down here so that when we pull it away, it goes right through. We're not going to do that though. We're going to leave it kind of open and the air can get in and out of it this way. Alright, and then I'm not going to do it yet, but I can smooth this off and make it look more beak-like. Maybe I'll take this end and make a little beak that comes up underneath. Cracks going on there, so I want to make sure it's smooth. You don't want the underside. Keep paying attention to the underside to make sure that it's smooth enough to, it's not going to crack as it dries. Alright, so let's say that's as thick as it's going to get there for the most part. Make the bottom one come up. Okay, we can smooth this, and we can do that later too. I'm going to round it a little bit at that end. I don't know if it's on the screen or not, but I'm dipping my hand in water to keep it smooth. There's my thickness. And I'm just going to make that a little smaller. I might make it actually connect to the upper beak too. And then just smooth off the excess there. So really, I'd want to slip and score in there a little bit. And any connections I make are a good thing. You don't want it to get too thick though. Like if you connect two pieces that are the thickness of your thumb, it's going to be twice as thick as your thumb, and it's going to dry at different speeds. Some of this you would want to save till the very last thing you do, because it's going to be harder to store, for one thing, and it may dry out faster, so you're going to want to wax it. Okay, I'm going to connect that, and then I'm going to draw the split that it would make here. So I'm going to push it off on this side too, connect the clay to the top and bottom, which is going to make it more stronger. And then we can imply that there's a split going all the way down later. And I kind of overscored here. You could also go in and put in something to reinforce, like a little coil in there to reinforce it if you have to. Okay, so there's how you would add the beak. I want to smooth it out. Maybe work the eyes. I don't think I'm going to put a hat on him now that I've got that big beak there. And keep in mind, this clay is really not as thick as it looks. Make that roll down that way. I didn't start out making a bird, so I don't have a reference for a bird, and I should. There's all different kinds of birds, and what I want to do, you know, I would have a sketch to know where I'm going with facial features and expressions and even texture, really. Okay. Now, any other stuff that I do, I can do on the surface. So I could give him a texture like feathers, or I can put, maybe I'm going to have him have like a mohawk of feathers. So if I were to do that, before I let this dry out, I'm going to poke holes and make sure the hole goes all the way through. If you use a fettling knife, a lot of people do this and they'll do that. So the hole is going to be tiny down here at the tip of the fettling knife. Okay? If you're spinning it like this, you've only got a hole that's maybe that big. It might look big on the outside of the clay, but inside it's much smaller. So you want to be careful of that. But I think I'm going to put rows of feathers up here. So, be 2. But I'm going to want to be very careful that I make those holes thicker on the inside once I get in there. We'll have to do one for taking it off the mold too when the time comes. I want to be centered. The other thing you want to do is you want to put in 2 holes for to hang it. Okay, one on either side, and you want it to be in the top third. Okay, like about the temples usually is a good place. Okay, so you don't want them too close to the edge. You want to make sure they go all the way through. We can clean that up later. Okay. Like I said, here I can take a tool and imply by carving in that's 2 separate pieces. It's hard to do when I can't see it, but let's say the upper lip is going to, or part is going to look like it's higher than the lower lip. So even though those clays are connected, you're going to slide this lower so that it appears as though it's 2 separate things. And you could give it dimples or, you know, make it come up and smile if you wanted to. But we're pushing that back. And I would do something similar on the other side. So it's connected more than it looks. Okay, and I would do the same thing over here. Get it good and connected. And we want to connect it on the inside too. I didn't do that, but you could even, you want to make sure you don't get air bubbles. Create a coil. My hands are pretty wet, so the coil is be pretty slippery. But if it's hard to get in there and you don't want to pull the clay away and make it any thinner, you can reinforce it with a coil or just a skinny little slab in there to connect the inside. Just make sure you press it to the point where you're sure there's no air bubbles. So this can reinforce it rather than pushing away. Like sometimes if you're smoothing away, you're smoothing away all the structure and the strength. Just be very careful not to get air bubbles when you do that. Okay, and we could curve this up if we wanted to. I kind of like it down better, but we'll see. Those are the kind of decisions you have to make before you let it dry out, though. And the key to this is it's on an armature. So drying out is an issue because we know the clay is going to shrink, and if it shrinks too much, the armature is not going to shrink. Okay? The clay on the armature is under the saran wrap, so it's not drying out, and the armature itself is plastic, so it's only got so much give. So that's a reductive way to make it appear that that's a separate beak, a lot lower than it is. Okay? So you want it to get leather hard, but you don't want it to get bone dry. Okay? And you can take, I don't have a lot of tools in this room, but you could take and create some sort of texture into this too. So maybe Maybe I'm going to layer. See if you can see what I'm doing here. Maybe we're going to layer a texture in like this to give that appearance. And my hands are so wet. Cleaning that off. Maybe it's going to go this way, all the way around. And it could go down the side. Almost like feathers, and they can overlap each other. Sometimes you might have to pick it up to get just the right angle, but I'm trying to keep it on the camera. This all has to be done while the clay is still pretty wet. You can come right up in there. I would have to lift it to get too many more layers here. And you could even use a pencil to make these holes. Thing is, you can only go so far. Without taking it off the armature. You can do a little work to it once it comes off the armature. You may have to do a little work to it when it comes off the armature. Really, I would want to start at the bottom and do this, but I'm just kind of giving you the idea that you can do all sorts of texture. This, we want to smooth that down. There's a little excess there that we don't need. That's a little easier to work when it's not on armature. But there's always so much you can do when it's not on the armature too. Okay, I'm not going to spend all of your time watching me make these, but I wanted you to get a sense of how you can create different textures as you go along. And the clay is very forgiving, so you could get smaller. You could use a smaller tool in areas and a bigger tool, and you can push it around if you don't like it and try something else. Just don't get too thin, because the clay isn't as thick as the armature. Okay, so I would say that's step number 2. I'm going to fine tune it. I'll show you that. We'll let it dry to the point of being leather hard, and then we're going to, I'll show you how to take it off the mold. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a good day.